I'm Jamie McKinley, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Just Get a Real Job. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome on the show this week Luke Wright, who is a poet and has just got a book out as well. It's about to go on tour. Someone I'm really excited to talk to. Doing the research, I've just been like, this is going to be a great episode. I've not had enough poets on the podcast either. Luke, thank you for coming on. It's lovely to be joined by you today.
It's very nice to meet you, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
How are you? Do you want to sort of start just by introducing yourself? I've just sort of described you as a poet, but you're kind of more than that. You toured with John Cooper Clarke. You've been going around, various theatres and pubs for many years and publishing books and stuff. So,
I've been a poet for 27 years, and it's been my full-time job since 2005. So what's that? 21 years. 21 years now. I've been living by my pen. I have written a fair few books now. I've got 5 full collections and lots of smaller collections out. And for a while, I wrote these verse plays, we call them. So just kind of poetic monologues, really. Plays in verse, one-man plays where I played the protagonist. So 3 of those, they were published as well. And I tour with Johnny Clarke. I make music with a man called Jim, whose professional name's Cobbler. And we've got a couple of albums out, and we're working on something new at the moment. So I do lots of different things, but it all kind of relates to poetry, really. Poetry is my first love, and that's where I feel most at home, most happy.
Yeah, well, this podcast is all about the creative industries. Obviously, being a poet is one of those. There's a lot of tropes about it. So growing up, most people, if they said to their teacher at school they wanted to be a poet, they'd be a bit like, "How are you going to do that?" So I'm quite intrigued to talk to you today because you've made a living from it. But just to start with, like, what's it like being a poet professionally, like full time? How do you actually make a living from that? Because there might be people listening that are like, "I want to do this," but it's really tricky.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sadly, no one actually really gives you any money to write poems. I mean, you might get the odd commission here and there, and someone will pay you a couple of grand to write a poem about a church or a poem about a wall somewhere, or I don't know, some sort of cultural thing. I mean, often those pieces, they're still rewarding in their own way, but a lot of that commission work that's not really you writing your proper stuff. It feels like you're right into a brief, really. So no one actually pays you to sit at your desk and write the stuff you want to write. So you've got to figure out a way of making money from that. And so there's 2 ways, really. You can sell products, and you can turn them into live shows. So I did the latter, really. I always wrote with a view to performance initially. So I was in a band when I was a teenager, and I wrote songs, and then I went to Colchester Arts Centre right at the end of 1998, and I saw John Cooper Clarke and Martin Nuwell, and a young man who was only a couple of years older than me at the time, a guy called Ross Sutherland, and they were doing stage poetry, and I'd never seen anything like that before. It was so exciting. It was this sort of mix between stand-up comedy and lyricism and philosophy. It was like being a sort of front man of a band, really, but without the band. And in between the poems, they told jokes, and all the poems played with language and played with ideas, and a lot of them had sort of very high concepts. And that was just so clever. I was utterly spellbound, and I thought, I want to do that. And I think also it came with the realization that it was something that I could do, like it played to my strengths. I wasn't much of a guitarist. I wasn't really much of a musician. I couldn't sing, so I needed someone to sing my words for me when I was in these bands. And I wanted to find a way of being sort of entirely self-reliant, really. So there was, whilst I loved it and really excited, there was this other element of like, well, I think I could do that. And that's really important. I think it's important for us to understand what our limitations are and what our strengths are. I think it's really useful. And the earlier you realize that, the quicker you can get on with doing what you're good at. I thought that's something I could do. I felt like I was a sort of bold enough person to go on stage completely on my own. Not that it wasn't terrifying at first, and not that I wasn't terrible at first. I mean, everybody always is, but I did think it was something I could do. And I think that's borne out over the last sort of, 2.5 decades. What's more, what I perhaps didn't realise at the time is that all the sort of shit parts of this job were things that I could sort of deal with as well. I'm quite happy to get in a car and drive for 5 hours and find some little art centre in the middle of nowhere and do a gig and stay in a crap hotel and come back. And that's really important as well, because you've got to be able to put up with the crap stuff. All jobs have got a shit part. Policemen will tell you they've got to do reams of paperwork which they hate. All jobs have got shit bits to them, and actually it's not even how much you want the good stuff; it's how much you can put up the shit stuff off on that. So I'm lucky that both sides of my job I can deal with, really. So yeah, and I was lucky that I hit upon that at the age of 16, really. So that was I got a bit of a head start. I mean, it's quite normal for people to start off in the creative industries when they're 16, 17, but I feel like it wasn't when I started doing poetry gigs all those years ago. There was myself and Ross. There seemed to be no other young people doing this at all, and I think that's different now. I think because you've got like YouTube. Obviously we've got YouTube, but when I started out, we didn't even have YouTube, so you couldn't see how did you see how did you find out about all the poets? If they were performance poets, if they were working live, you had to actually go and see them live. So and I think nowadays, if you're interested in spoken word, there's thousands of people online that you can watch, and so from a younger age, people are getting involved and putting their own stuff out there.
Yeah, but I also think it's testament to the generation of poets that are doing spoken words, because there's still to some people that perception that poetry is like a really posh like thing, when it's not actually like that. There's like rock and roll poetry and the stuff that you do yourself. There's loads of great stuff, and I think it's become more popular. Maybe it hasn't, but from growing up. But I mean,
certainly, yeah, I would definitely think that the poetry's become way more popular in the sort of 25 years that I've been doing it, definitely, without a doubt. He didn't have anyone like Rupi Kaur or Kay Tempest or Holly McNish or Harry Baker, or these poets are selling big rooms, and there wasn't really anyone like, even John Cooper Clarke back in the 90s was selling 100 seats. I mean, there was, I guess, Roger McGough, Pam Ayres, they were selling big halls, but not, it wasn't many others. And there's a number, I'd say there's like, for my generation alone, there's probably about sort of 6, 7 of us now who all tour in decent sized mid-scale venues. So yeah, I think definitely, and that's good, because the more of us there are, the more audience it generates. It's not like there's not like a finite amount of audience. I think the thing is, if people see Holly McNish or they see Kay Tempest, they might go, oh, I really enjoyed watching poetry, I'm going to see what else is out there. So it's all good. It's all healthy.
Yeah, I got into sort of understanding what spoken word was. It was through the Arctic Monkeys doing the John Cooper Clarke poem and making it, like, because I loved that band growing up. Most people my sort of age group do, but that's how I discovered John Cooper Clarke, and then been lucky to see him live a few times. Then you really see like how that art form can work. I want to sort of talk to you as well, Luke, about your sort of early. So I always ask our guests about their early creative memories. You kind of touched on it there, seeing poetry for the first time in 1998. But how is where you're from? And this might tie into your sort of your new book as well, which I know is very reflective and some of the stuff you're exploring now. But how is where you're from sort of influenced you as a poet and as a creative person?
Well, I grew up in Colchester, or near Colchester, from about the age of 3 until I was 18. I went off to university. And yeah, I think definitely. I mean, so me and my best mate John, we formed a band when we were at school, and we started doing gigs around the local music scene. So we'd play at the Y Club in Chelmsford, and the Ollie Twist in Colchester, and sometimes the Colchester Art Centre. So they're all the sort of venues, and we got to meet other people doing that. And so there was like a little community of sort of like indie kind of bands, and I got to know those people. It was also through Colchester that I met Martin Nuwell. So Martin Nuwell is a songwriter and a poet, had been bands when he was a younger man, and then wrote a lot of poems through his 30s and 40s. So mainly poems. He now sort of mainly does music again. So his band was the Cleaners from Venus. Really, they've become a real cult hit, really, in the last sort of 5-10 years. I mean, they've got millions of streams on Spotify now. But Martin, for most of his music career, couldn't make a living out of it. He actually made a living out of poetry. He was Britain's most frequently published poet throughout the 90s. He had 3 poems a week published in The Independent. I think one of the only living poets to have a poem published on the front page of a national newspaper. So but he was never part of the poetry world, and that was quite sort of anti the poetry world, and would tell them all to fuck off and stuff. He was in Wivenhoe, and he ran a songwriting course and a lyric writing course at the local college, Colchester Sixth Form College. I think it was just meant to be for under 18s, but not a lot of people signed up. So they sort of threw it open to adults as well. So I went along aged, I guess I was in year 10, so just turning 15. And I went along to this thing every Monday night. It was 2 hours. And Martin just sort of talked at us for 2 hours and told us everything he knew about songwriting and pop music and lyricism. I never met anyone, never seen anyone up close like that. The genuine alternative. He looks like one of the Rolling Stones, man, and talks like one as well. And he's just talking about all this music. And I know it was my entry into alternativeness, really. Completely changed my life. Spending those sort of 8 hours over 4 weeks in the company of Martin Nuwell. And he talked about what he called pop poetry or stand-up poetry, and so I was my first time I was aware of it, really. And he talked about John Cooper Clarke, and he played some stuff, and I don't remember necessarily being struck by anything he talked about, other than that I thought, poetry's cool because Martin does it. So I went along to watch him mainly, and then I saw John Cooper Clarke and Ross at the same time. So yeah, I mean, if I hadn't been in Colchester, because John Cooper Clarke lives in Colchester as well, has lived in Colchester since the mid-80s. So, I had two of Britain's finest performing poets living, in my vicinity. Yeah, and I got to know both of them when I was still a kid. I don't even know how I did that. I think I probably just went up to them and pestered them. I mean, I did a project when I was still at school about, it was for, I don't know what you call personal and social studies now. I don't know. I think it was called general studies back then. But that sort of subject everyone has to take, and it's all about
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
they called it it might be different in Scotland, but I think it was called like PSE when I was at school. Was what they
Yeah, or
called it.
PHSE. Oh, yeah, exactly that thing. So I decided to do like a project on music and drugs, right? Because that was cool. And I remember I interviewed both John Cooper Clarke and Martin Nuwell about drug use in the music industry, and that was when I was 16. So I must have, I must have rung them up and was like, "Oh, can I meet you?" And so at some point I got their telephone numbers off. I don't know how I managed to do that. So I was obviously very forward. Yeah, and then when I did my first gig, it was with Ross. Yeah, it was supporting Ross, I think. Like a month after that gig, he came back. He'd been at my sixth form college, and he came back to give a talk. Ex-student done well. If you work hard, you can be like Ross and go to university. So he came and did this little gig of reading his poems at Colchester sixth form, and I managed to blag the support slot because since I'd seen him before, I'd written a poem every single day for a month. I just sat there and all the ideas sort of spewed out of me. So that was really where I was really pivotal because you had Martin and John, who would then in turn inspired Ross, who then in turn inspired me, all in the space of a few years. And if I'd been somewhere else, that wouldn't have happened quite like that. So, and that really they the four of us still do a gig together at Christmas every year. We have done since the early 2000s. So yeah, so yeah. I mean, it was great. It was a great place to be. It turned out, even though there wasn't any poetry nights going on there, I had these two sort of titans who I could sort of look up to, and yeah. And obviously I still tour with John. John and I tour all around the country together, and I've been touring with him since about 10, which is kind of when he got to the point, because following the Arctic Monkeys thing, I don't think they hadn't put 13 out at that point, but they had sort of bigged him up, and he'd done some support slots with them, and it's just sort of, I think more than anything else, and not just that, because I used to program Latitude Festival, and I put John on as a headline act. I mean, and John, he was doing cash in hand gigs, small cash in hand gigs, and had been for years. Even like when we got on for that first Latitude, he was like, "Oh, can you pay me cash in hand?" Like he didn't like. So then he got new management after them, the Arctic Monkey stuff, and they basically sorted out all of his affairs, so he could properly go out there and gig again. And so it really changed at that point, and he was playing much bigger halls, so he could afford to have support acts along. So he asked me to come along, and myself and Mike Gowrie, between us, pretty much done all those gigs for the last 15 years. Sorry, I'm getting off the point, but culture stuff.
No, it's all really interesting. Really interesting.
I never would have been around John and Martin's. Things would have been very different if I hadn't been there.
It kind of does show though, like I get this a lot from interviewing people working in the arts, like how important it is to have people in the place you're from, or like have that ecosystem around you. So if you're in a band, I know lots of great bands in Scotland, and what's been really useful is if a band gets bigger, it helps all the other bands around them. It's not a competitiveness, it's actually useful to have.
No, it was what I was saying about Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. I think it's, yeah, I don't think so. It's not people that go, well, I've seen one poetry gig this year, so I can't see any more. I don't, I know, I look at my contemporaries, Holly and Harry and Rob Alton and Kay and, and the other guys who are slightly older, like Brian Bilston and Henry Normal. It's like, it's good for all of us that we're all out there doing gigs because it develops people's interest in poetry, which leads to, them going, oh, maybe I enjoyed Brian Bilston, maybe I'll take a punt on Luke next time round, or vice versa. So no, it's all good. But it's interesting about that, about people being in the area. I think that's particularly true in 1998 when there isn't the internet and there isn't a way. When Ross and I first started going other places and getting booked to go play Bristol or Manchester or Liverpool or what have you, we'd go to these places in the early 2000s and there'd be like a different sound, different style in each place. And often those, and there was this, you could say the same about Norwich, which is where we were at that point, there was a sort of house style. And often that would be, there'd be one or two people who were kind of the leaders of that group, who were the most prolific and, most gifted. And, and people would sort of develop a style similar to them, they'd sort of lead the way. What really started to change after YouTube in about 2006, 2007 is that you'd go to Manchester, but you'd find like a young person who sounded like K Tempest, or a young person who sounded like Scroobius Pip or Polar Bear, or because they'd see the stuff on YouTube and go, oh, I want to be like that, and they'd sort of, and all of us copy when we start out. In fact, it was John Cooper Clarke's advice to me. He went, find someone you like and sort of rip them off a bit, and then your own style will come out of that. I mean, it's true. We all start off sounding, and very few people come with a completely new voice. I actually think in some ways, if you're a less talented mimic, which I always think I wasn't very good at mimic. I've got friends who were very good, writers and very good mimics, and they were too good at mimic. And so their stuff would sound exactly like who it was they were trying to mimic, whereas I was never quite good enough. My style sort of came through a bit quicker. I think that was really played to my advantage. But anyway, you all of a sudden after the internet really, it took off in that way, and the beginnings of social media, as you stop seeing that sort of local sound, and you started to see a more sort of standardized sort of style across all spoken word across Britain, and more people started sounding like the American poets, and it's a shame really in a way, because it was quite nice to have those little pockets of style sort of brimming up everywhere, and I'm glad I sort of caught the tail end of that. But it's yeah. So I guess the point is, it's less important now where you grow up, I think, because you have this whole smorgasbord of stuff that you can look at and that you can take influence from.
Yeah, and it's kind of magic and build your own like audience. Like, you were 16 and you're bold enough to sort of like get the phone number of these like poets that you idolize. But nowadays, like, I suppose the same could happen. If you're 16, like, you can make a TikTok account if you're a poet and have an audience that's huge, it's bigger than like television.
Well,
that was mad.
I mean, there's shitloads of poets. I keep coming across new poets on Instagram who have sort of like 250,000 followers. I've never heard of them. I've no idea who they are. They've got, and obviously, but they've sort of gone straight from doing stuff on Instagram, and they've now got a book out with Ebury or some big publisher, and they're not part of a scene. They haven't come up through a scene. They're just doing that. So, unlike more power to their elbow, it's kind of, it's really impressive, really impressive. I still haven't got the hang of the social media, clearly, because I'm still got like 10,000 followers or whatever. So
That's very good, man.
Well, I mean, it's funny, isn't it, about how the followers, how does it translate into ticket sales? Like, I think someone like Harry Baker, Harry Baker's got loads of followers now. I don't know exactly what he's got, but he's got, he's over 100,000 followers. He's had some real successes, but he's also got a really big live following. He's playing really big rooms. And Holly McNish as well. Holly McNish plays really, really big rooms and sells out lots of stuff. So that's kind of works. But I think also these young poets out there who haven't even perhaps put together a full show yet, but they've got tens of thousands of followers. So I think we are about to see a real explosion of poets on the live circuit playing, genuinely. And I think we're just on the cusp of something. I think 10 years time, there's going to be a lot of poets out there touring around, and I think that's really exciting.
I actually think AI is going to make more people interested in things like poetry and real things like that, because they want that genuine connection and like, I'm noticing this a lot. I mean, I'm script editor full time in TV as my day job, and
Hmm.
I'm there's obviously a lot of I didn't expect to bring up AI today, but there's a lot of discussion around it. But I do think people seem really keen to just have like genuine connect. So I know a lot of people that have started going to poetry nights because partly that reason, and or feel like more attached to people's real voices and stuff. I don't know if
Yeah.
you'd agree.
Well, I think. Well, I think that could be true. I mean, I think AI is a bit like supermarkets, isn't it? Like you know, supermarkets have not killed off the little high street. Like I live in a little town called Bungay in Suffolk. We've got a little really thriving high street now, but it's full of the kind of shops where you get a personal experience or got high quality stuff, or we've got lovely butchers and a deli and a fishmongers and all that sort of stuff. So for most people, they get most of their stuff from the supermarket. However, when they want something good or real, or then they still comes to local shops. So for a while, it looked like the supermarkets would kill off those shops, but it doesn't, because people still require, and if you can afford it, I guess you can come to the smaller shops, the artisan shops, and have that artisan experience. And I suspect AI will start to cater for a lot. It'll do a lot of shit, the basic shit that we need doing. I wouldn't be surprised. It'll write television programs. Maybe. I mean, some of the stuff I watch on TV, I'm like, well, I can't imagine AI could do a worse job. There's some, I don't know. I watched this program the other day. Maybe I shouldn't say, it's not fair to slag off someone else's work, but anyway, there's some like whodunit stuff, or like all that Harlan Coben stuff they have on Netflix. It's so terrible that I'm like, bring on the AI, because
They they use that.
They use AI.
They use the algorithm. It's more like the algorithms to check people's watching habits. So it's kind of tied in. So there's.
So
I think
they make sure they put certain things in at certain times. Well, yeah, fine.
Yeah.
It though all those programs are basically, you want to know what happens, but you don't really enjoy finding, the process of finding out, which is just, exactly. It's sort of very mercenary, isn't it? It's sort of playing to our, sort of playing on our bases instincts, isn't it? So, all that stuff will happen, but people will still, as you say, will want something genuine and real. And poetry is a great place to find that. I think people trust poets, which is why I hated it when the poets were all doing loads of adverts a few years ago. We had loads of poetry and adverts, because I just think it sort of devalues all of us in a way, because it makes it look like everyone's just, I don't know. Like I think there's a sort of trustworthiness, and certainly, like, politically speaking, when I got into poetry, there was a strong political element. It wasn't necessarily politics with a big P, because neither John Cooper Clarke or Martin Nuwell are sort of very political. It was, a lot of stuff was about issues, and it was social commentary, and you have to be able to trust those people. And I think that was the same with comedy. I think, alternative comedy, you could trust those voices. You felt that they weren't really in the pay of anybody. But then see, comedy became big business. Maybe poetry will become big business as well. But then you'll have to be able to sort of differentiate your Michael McIntyres from your Stuart Lees. So I don't know. I don't think poetry will ever really appeal quite as much as comedy does, because I just think comedy is easier to sort of just tap in and out of, really. Poetry requires a bit more of people, but I don't know. Who knows what will go, because there's a hunger for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't get Rupi Kaur selling 1 million books, or these Insta poets, having 500,000 followers or whatever. So, there is a hunger for it out there, I guess.
I think people love good storytelling, and that'll hopefully remain as well. Yeah, I hope so. Look, if you don't mind, I was wondering as well if you'd be happy to share a few poems throughout this episode.
Yeah, sure.
If you'd be happy to share one with us now, that would be great.
Cool. So this is Later Life Letter. For those of you watching on video,
Beautiful cover.
Look, this is me. This is little old me when I'm 18 months old. I look very cute. For those who can't see, I'm wearing a pair of blue dungarees, and I'm very blonde, and I have enormous cheeks. So I'll start. Should we start with it? So this is a book about. So I'm adopted, and this is a book about adoption and about my family and my story, and ultimately about love, really. So I'll start with the title poem, which is the first poem in the book. It's called Later Life Letter, and it's for my wife, Katie. Your last day as a frontline social worker, and you're still up writing later life letters. A few pages for an adopted child to read when they are old enough to understand. A voice to speak across the years. I have my own. I first read it aged 18. My social worker wrote in her own hand to tell me that I have 2 brothers, that my father was a stonemason, that he went fishing with his dad, and the 2 families sometimes shared a Sunday roast. It tells me that my parents split and that my mother didn't know she was pregnant. My birth was a surprise. I'm not sure if I believe that, but like the absence of the kind of horror stories you bring home from work, I was glad of it. I wish you'd rest and come to bed, but you write on, hunched over your desk, sweat beaded on your forehead, as you speak softly across the years. She tried her best. She loved you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing the poem, Luke. It's a really nice poem, and definitely going to order this after this chat as well. I'm definitely going to get the book. It's probably a nice time to talk about later life, later, and what it's all about, and the tour and stuff as well. Can you sort
Yeah.
of? I thought it was interesting. I watched an interview. I think you were talking about how you ended up marrying a social worker, which had me laughing this morning. But it's really nice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I guess that's where it kind of started. I've always known I was adopted ever since I was tiny. And I grew up with my parents. They're very matter of fact people. But they don't struggle with the language of love at all. Like I was always told how much I was loved and cherished, and I knew about my adoption, but it wasn't analysed. It was sort of like, you're adopted, but we love you, and that's simple. And I thought, oh yeah, that is simple. That's good. And it was after my divorce. I sort of, and I was in another relationship for a while, and I came out of that, and I went to see a therapist, and I wanted to talk about my love life, and I said to the therapist, FYI, I'm adopted, but it's not really a big thing for me. And she looked at me as if to say, "Oh, mate," and she told me about primal wound theory, which is essentially that adoption, even if you go to even if you are loved from a very young age by an adoptive family, as I went to them when I was 5 weeks old, that separation that you have from your biological mother, very often or nearly always causes a sort of a primal wound, which can result in depression or anxiety or mistrust and problems in relationships. And I don't think I have a particularly bad primal wound, but a lot of that sort of rung true. Of course, the danger with this sort of thing is you can go, oh, well, this is my excuse to be a total cunt because I can't help it. I have this primal wound, and it's. But I think for me, I've always told myself a story that I'm very, very, very privileged, and I'm very lucky, and life comes easily to me, and so anything that goes wrong is just entirely the result of me fucking up, and I should be better, really. And I think that process I went through in therapy there sort of gave me permission to cut myself some slack and to feel sorry for myself to a certain extent. But that's not to say that that's my new story. I think actually there's a lot of validity to the idea that I grew up, I'm adopted, I'm very lucky, and it's not really a big deal. So as I start to explore in this book, so I ended up writing these sort of 55 poems about my childhood and about my journey towards finding out more about my biological family. I think I come to the conclusion that the funny thing about adoption is it's both nothing and everything. You can choose, really, to an extent, what story you want to tell yourself about that. So I sit somewhere in the middle. So it's been useful to explore that, and I think definitely I'm a calmer and more grounded person for understanding. Where that sort of slight sort of, that's like hollow feeling comes from sometimes, and that's not to say that I have particularly difficult problems in life or that I'm any more worthy of it than anything else. But I think having that period of self-reflection and going back has been really useful. So in the end, I haven't contacted my birth family, but I do know quite a lot about them. I know where they are. I know who they are. And that's been really useful. And this process of writing poems has been kind of a sort of, I guess, an act of like taking control of my past. When we're children, well, none of us have much control over our lives when we're children, but I think that's exacerbated if you are a child who's been in care or a child that's been adopted or fostered, because huge decisions have been made about your life which completely change who you are. Change your whole identity. And I think that by going back over it and understanding it and writing about it and taking ownership of that, it's been useful for me to feel better about everything, really. So that's essentially what it's been about. And it's been great to produce work. And from the book, I've crafted a show of about sort of half the poems in the book, and I link it together with stand-up, and I try and try not to sort of pause in between the poems. So I go from poem into chat, into poem into chat like that, and sort of weave it all together. But I've done it once. I launched it on Friday at the South Bank Centre, and it went really well, much better than I expected. So I'm very excited about the next sort of year that I've got, because the book comes out and, we'll get reviews and take it off on tour. And I've got about sort of 75 dates or so. So, yeah, it's going to be a big year, and I'm proud of the work, and I'm sort of excited to share it with the world now.
And just for the listeners as well at home watching, there's links to all Luke's work in the show notes, and you can find out more about the tour, where to get tickets and all the dates and stuff. Or purely selfishly, Luke, are you going to be in Scotland with this book at all?
I am. I'm precious few dates in Scotland. I mean, at the moment, I have one Edinburgh Book Festival date in August. I don't even know when that is, but at some point during Edinburgh Book Festival, I'll be there. Often I come to the Fringe. That's generally what I do with my show, but normally I do that. I normally launch a show at the Fringe and then take it on tour, and then I use the sort of couple of weeks that I spent at the Fringe to get to know it and to feel it and pick it apart. But because this book was coming out in January, the show had to start in January, so there seemed little point to flogging the show at the Fringe for 3 weeks when I'd already been doing it for half a year. So I've rewarded myself with a year off the Edinburgh Fringe. Love it though I do. It's not good for my health, and it's not fair on my family and all that sort of stuff. So I will be doing it at Edinburgh Book Festival, and I think I'm coming to Peebles, and I hope we might do something in Glasgow at some point, but I'm still waiting on various dates to fall into line. But yeah,
Let's go lines up. But no, that's great. I'm not to make your tour all about myself, but no, it's always good to know.
No, it's because I always do that month in Scotland, or that 2 weeks in Scotland. I sort of hope that sort of covers it a little bit. But I mean, I don't have a touring agent. I haven't worked with touring agents for about 15 years, so I do it all myself, which is nice. You have a real connection with the venues you go to. You build up those personal relationships. I had some bad experiences with agents before, sort of actually been quite rude to venues, and and destroying relationships that I had. So, and I'm not saying that all touring agents, I'm sure there's lots of very good touring agents out there, but I found this works for me. But what it does mean is that I'm entirely, I've got to build up places slowly, and so it just, and being based down south, it's just harder to get to Scotland, really. So I've done very little touring in Scotland, which is a source of much regret. I'd like to spend more time in Scotland, so hopefully that will change.
Well, hopefully all the Scottish listeners will enjoy this episode, and it'll create more
Add you
demand
your
for you as
local
well.
arts centre and try and get me on there. Yeah.
I kind of want to ask you a bit more about being a full-time poet for a lot of our listeners who are maybe aspiring creatives in different ways. But it was interesting you were talking about you organise your own tours and stuff now. But what does a sort of normal week look like for you if you're on tour, or if you're trying to craft a new show and stuff?
Okay, so I think it's a very typical week for me would be, imagine I've got two gigs. Let's say the gigs are on Friday and Saturday. So the rest of the week would be, so generally what I do is, I'm a father. I've got 2 boys. My youngest lives with me full time. My eldest goes back and forth between his mum's house and my house. So I've got the kids to get up every morning. That's what I do. I get my kids up and get them off to school, make them their lunch, and then I go for a walk, and then I come and sit down at my desk about sort of 9:30, and I try and write for the 2.5 hours until about midday, and then I go for a swim, and then I come home and I have lunch, and I do all my admin in the afternoon, which is always loads of that, whether it's social media posts, or updating website, or organising bits of the tour. I mean, the tours I tend to, what I do is, if when I've played a venue, I then get in touch with them, the following Monday, and say, thank you. Here's my invoice. I'd love to come back next year. Can we get a date in the diary? And so I'm fortunate that I've got a great relationship with most of the venues I go to now, whereas we can pretty much get a sort of little placeholder in the diary for the following year, even if I don't necessarily know what the next year's show's going to be. So yes, I do live, when I'm at home, I sort of really work at a nice pace that is my own, and as long as I can get a few hours writing in the morning, I can take care of the rest of my which is why I wanted to do this interview with you in the afternoon today, because I try and keep those mornings sacred for writing. And then then if I go off and tour, I say, I mean, I'm always touring, really, touring, quote unquote, because I'm not going from venue to venue. I'm generally doing 2 or 3 shows a week, and that's mostly sort of late January through to June, and then September through to November. And then there's some stuff over the summer, but it varies. And so then, like come Friday, I'll jump in my car, drive off to wherever it is I'm playing that night, and I will go and sound check about 5-6 o'clock, have some dinner, then come and do the show, go back to whatever premiere in it is I'm staying in that night. And then the next day, maybe do a bit of writing, have a sort of quiet day, and then drive off to the next place and do that. So that it's not too arduous, and it's a nice way of living your life. You are on the road at least a couple of nights a week, which is it makes it harder for home, and I have to be quite on it because I've got a household to run and everything. So I don't know if that's too much detail, but that's how I try. I try and live well, because I think that's good for writing. I think if you're giving yourself the time to walk or exercise or whatever, that's good, because I have that time on my own. Also, that time I spend in the car is really good for either rehearsing, running lines of new poems, or just letting your mind wander. So you are developing your thinking, because if you're not developing your thinking, you're not ready to write the next thing. You're just writing the same poem over and over again. I found in lockdown, I thought, oh, great, I've suddenly got every day of my life to write. Well, the reality was I was writing the same poem again and again and again, because I was in the same place. So you can't force these things, really. You have to go out and sort of live and let your thinking move on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think often there's this weird thing that creative people think, oh, I need to be a tortured artist to get the best stuff. But as you say, I think if you actually are able to look after your health and mental health and have a sort of full life, it really helps. It really does help. I find it does anyway.
Yeah. I mean, look. I mean, certainly conflict and adversity, is good. And I've just read a book about the complex feelings around being adopted, and that is good subject matter. But I wrote a show last year called Joy, and it was a show celebrating being at a nice stage in my life, and I was able to write that just as easily, really, and that was just as engaging for an audience. I certainly think that whilst writing about adversity is good, and there's lots to say, generally you don't write very good stuff if you're depressed. I mean, I think almost impossible to. It takes a huge amount of mental energy to write and to create. And I think if you are depressed, it's almost impossible to do. So no, I'm a big believer in good, clean mental health, best I can. And I fall off the wagon as much as anyone else does, and it's hard to be healthy when you're on the road sometimes, and you're rushing and you've got too much on. But I do try and keep myself grounded best I can, and I'm getting better at that as I get older, because I'm more in command of myself, as I think we generally always are as we get older.
I think it's also really nice to hear you talk about the admin side of your job as well, because a lot of people, I think you touched it at the start though, and I think this is something we're not always taught to do when we're trying to have a full-time career in creative industries, is like knowing what your limitations are as well, but also knowing what you're willing to put up with, because a lot of people just see the person winning the BAFTA or like them directing the film, and they don't think about all the other stuff that comes with that job, like the long days or the not seeing your family because you're on the road or whatever it might be.
Yeah, for some people, that's just they could not cope with going away 2-3 nights a week, and it does take a lot of I think it takes quite a lot of fortitude to be able to sort of pack your stuff in the car. But I have loads of. I've become good at it. Like I always travel the same bag. I mean, right now it's like having sensible packing cubes and like a laundry bag that I take with me, and all this sort of stuff to make me much more efficient on the road. Because the last thing because if you don't know what's going on, and you've got a suitcase that's massively disorganized, and you're going from place to place, you lose stuff. You feel stressed. Like. That's not a good way of living your life. And if you can take the healthy habits you have at home on the road with you, that's really good. Because I think the temptation is you get on the road and you're just, you're living in a different way, and you're sort of living, and you end up being unhealthy, or I try not to drink during the week, so I try not to do that when I'm on the road. Doesn't always happen, but I try and take those healthy habits from home on the road, because if I'm on the road too much, to let it all sort of slide. And I am too old now to drink till 4 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday and then go and do a tour gig on the Thursday. I don't want to do that. I don't want to live my life like that. So I think it's a really big part of it. It's such a big part is actually just being organised. What Martin Newell would call gig fit. I remember I doing this little tour with Martin, and he kept like losing this and losing that, and you're not, and I was just going. And he went, "Oh, the thing is," he goes, "you're gig fit." He says, "You do this every week. You know." He goes, "I bet you know where everything is at all times." And I was like, "Yeah, I do. I know what pocket I keep my train tickets in, and what pocket I keep." You're just sort of you're organised because you have to be, and that's really useful. I think it's really stressful to tour around if you don't. Like, you haven't got your shit together. So having your shit together is really, and I know that sounds counterintuitive. Your artists are meant to be like kind of like chaotic and, fascinating with it. But actually I'm like a member of the military, basically. So I have to be.
It's also about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, again, as you said, like, because some people aren't. If you're a very like disorganized person, then that's maybe when it's useful to try and get somebody who can manage your tour or something.
Right, exactly. And I have friends who definitely couldn't do this because they have ADHD so bad that they literally that and lots of artists do have I mean, I think I probably am a bit ADHD, but I've got some very good coping strategies. But yeah, I have friends who couldn't do that. I don't know. I find. Yeah. I mean, I've got a book agent, and she's fantastic, and I really trust her, and I'm really happy just to let her take care of those things. But I think so much of you always have to be the one driving your career, even when I've had sort of booking agents and stuff before. No one's ever going to care about your career as much as you do. So
It's really, really, really interesting that phrase has come up on the last like couple of podcasts I put out. I don't know, maybe I don't know if it's in the zeitgeist, but like this driving your career thing is really a lot of people are sort of creative people I've been interviewing have been saying that because I think at the moment there's less opportunities in the creative industries in certain industries especially, and things feel quite hard because of the cost of living and things like that. So I think it's this idea. I think it's good for people to hear that you sometimes you don't suddenly
yeah.
get an agent and everything's fine.
Yeah, I mean that's the old cliche, isn't it? You're this bunch of kids, and you've got a great hit song, and you don't know what you're doing, but you've got a great manager, and they drive it all forward. Well, I'm sure that still happens, and I think perhaps it happens when there is a lot of money to be made, but there is not a lot of money to be made in poetry. So you don't really have that all-encompassing manager figure. So you end up having to do chunks of it yourself anyway, whether you've got an agent or not. And I just found it was easier just to sort of book my own gigs and develop my own relationships with people, and more rewarding. And I mean, like someone like John Hegley, I know that he parted company with his agent. He was great, but he wanted to do it himself because he wanted to have that contact. So, yeah, it certainly worked fine for me, just splitting my time between being my manager and being me, suits me. I feel like I've got enough time to write. And yeah. But I guess the disadvantage is you don't have the same capacity. For example, if I was with a booking agent, they would be getting me into Scotland because they'd have relationships with every single venue in the country, and I haven't got time to develop that in quite the same way. So swings and roundabouts, I guess, but I'm happy with it like this.
For sure. Speaking about writing, actually, I wanted to also ask you about this. But like, do you have a way that you sit down and write? Is it different? Does it just depend on the poem or the thing you're working on, or do you have like a sort of approach you take?
Well, it sort of depends what I'm doing. Like I'm still trying to write a novel at the moment. So starting really, this week I need to, because I've been kind of preoccupied with getting the show up and running for last week. I need to sit down and start working on that again. So that'll be my thing that I do 4 days a week. I'll be sitting down doing that, and then 1 day a week I want to be writing a poem. So I want to try and do a poem a week this year. I've had a very lazy year last year. I did write quite a lot of this first draft of a novel, but I didn't get many poems written last year, and I was a bit because I'd finished writing Later Life Left, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. So I was casting around for a subject, and I think I've got one now. So, I'm excited to write more poems, and I'm going to give my next show a title, and then I'm going to start writing to the show. At the moment, I'm still throwing ideas around and seeing what I've got, but I think probably come halfway through this, well, no, probably in about 3-4 months, I'm gonna sort of fix on a title and make sure I get it all written together. But yeah, I mean, I ideas come to you at all times, particularly when you're driving and walking, I find. And so I note down the idea, whether it's a line or an image or a title. And then I think, right, I'm going to sit down and do some writing. What have I got to have a look at and see what takes my fancy? And then I sort of take this little thread that I've got and see if I can sew it into something bigger.
That's really, I think people always find it really, but I always get that question from writers that listen to this podcast. Like, I love it when you ask like the person, whoever it is,
How
how
they
they
do it,
approach their thing. As if there's like a
how it's
perfect
done.
answer, but everyone's so different. That's the funny thing. Everyone's completely different.
Yeah, well, it's it's easier when you're doing something. I mean, often I find what I have done recently when I've been writing shows that sort of start in the summer, I do my first preview, like a really rough preview at the Larne Festival in March. And so generally, January and February, I'm sitting down every day to actually write the show, and I'm sewing in poems that I've got already, and I'm filling gaps by going, right, I need a poem about such and such to sort of get from this idea to that idea. So that's what I'm normally doing now, and I'm not doing that now because I've already got my new show, and I'm just launching it. But I am starting to think about what I will do in January next year, and whether I sort of do a stopgap and take me through to the summer, or whether I sort of start afresh in January. I'll probably just start afresh in January, to be totally honest. So I am starting to think now, what's that show going to be? What's it going to look like? But I'm not really at the stitching it together stage yet. I've got a little while yet. So I think probably that'll happen probably in the autumn. So at the moment, I'm just free to sort of write and throw ideas into a big basket and see what sticks.
It is mad as well how far you have to think ahead when you're managing
Yeah.
all this stuff like this.
Yeah. And I will start now going to venues and saying to them, "Oh, can we put a date in the diary for next year, please?" And they'll say, "What's the show?" And I'll go, "I don't know yet, but if you, if you could trust me." And I'm fortunate that I've been to enough of these places enough times now where people are happy just to go, "Yeah, well, we'll take whatever you do next," because they know that I'll come back every year with a new show. Yeah.
Would you be happy to share another poem with us now?
Great. Okay. I'll read this one because it's not on the show and I haven't read it for a little while. It's called Gene Pool. When I see a new photo of my birth mother, I think of the promo shot of me holding my last book. The faraway stare, a hint of fear. Weird to think I have a stranger's eyes. When I was 15, I sat opposite my dad and grandfather, both slurping their soup. It was like a time-lapse video, one becoming the other, and I quipped afterwards I'd never felt so glad to be adopted. But I was a teenager then, keen to push off into the vast, cold lake of life. Now sometimes I think I'd like to be roped slackly at the waist of those men, to let the weight of them pull me beneath the waterline when my turn comes. I have my sons, with whom I share my small nose and protruding ears, and I in time will pull them down. But you'll excuse me if I thrash about from time to time, being as I am, unweighted. I don't think
Thank you
I've ever
very
read
much
that
for
aloud.
sharing.
So there you go.
Tell us a quick bit about that poem and how that.
Well, it's just sort of this idea of, I mean, it's this sort of idea of being biologically related to a stranger. I mean, and not having that sort of connection. I've always accepted that. I never really bothered. As I say, when I was a teenager, I used to look at my, I used to quite like the fact that I didn't look like my family. I sort of was my own thing, really. But you get to a point, and sometimes you sort of you want it to be easy, and this idea of like I'd quite like to just be, biologically attached. I mean, I think that's really why I come to the conclusion of this book is that for all the thinking about my biological family, I don't really feel any great connection to them. I'd think I'd probably be happy to, it'd be easier not to have this thing, this thing that I'm adopted. It'd be nice to just be the biological son of my adoptive parents. That would be, then I wouldn't have to think about all this sort of stuff. And sometimes you want it to be easy, and other times you relish the complexity of it, and as it's something to explore. Like, is it a gift to be adopted, to have all this stuff to think about, or is it just an inconvenience? Well, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing you can do about it. So yeah,
I think it must be really
well,
nice
well,
it would be really nice for people that have had a similar experience to you growing up to like have a book like this. I still don't think there's enough books about adoption or the care
yeah.
system and things.
And it's a very positive story of adoption as well. I think there's lots of sort of, I think maybe the stories we hear about adoption are more dramatic or sadder maybe. And this is a pretty positive story of adoption. So I hope so. I mean, that's why any of us write and create, is because we hope that something we produce might sort of build a bridge from our hearts to theirs, and that your work could help somebody. Yeah. It's nice to feel useful, isn't it? Yeah.
No, for sure. And this is actually the first time I've ever been able to ask someone to read poetry like this on the podcast. When I've done nearly 186 or something mad episodes of this, so I've done it for a long time. And when
Amazing.
I first started this in lockdown, I used to read terrible poems that I'd written myself. I've not done that in many years, but so it's quite nice. It feels nice for me to have a professional like you doing this on the show. I've got a few more questions before we wrap up. One is just about you've been performing for such a long time. Do you ever still get nervous doing like a show live or anything?
I got nervous on Friday night before I did my show at the South Bank. I get nervous when it's new, and I get nervous when the stakes are high. So it was a brand new show in front of 300 people. That was just, I mean, you'd be mad if you weren't nervous. So I was nervous then, and I really felt it coming on a couple of hours before the show. I mean, I don't tend to be nervous in the days leading up to it. I'm excited about it, but I'm fortunate that it's, I can let it sort of hit me, when it's showtime, and I can, I've got friends who, they're nervous all day and they're pacing all day, and I'm glad I don't feel like that, because I think it would take a lot out of you. But generally not. If I know what I'm doing, I'll probably maybe the next couple of shows I'll be a bit nervous before I go on, but I'm always, there's always something, isn't there? Because I'm generally no good at least half an hour before a show. I have to be on my own, and I have to, I'm working. So it's not nothing. It's not like I'm just sitting at the bar and I get called through and I go, oh, I stumble on stage. I go into my own little space and psych myself up. So I think maybe nervousness is not the right word for it, but I feel it. I feel the weight of the task ahead of me.
No, it's interesting. I suppose because you've been doing it for so long as well, you give yourself that evidence. You've got 20 odd years of evidence knowing you can do it as well, and that you've delivered. Do you ever get like writer's block, or ever, do you ever like worry if you can't think? I know it's interesting you're saying you think of your show like a year ahead. Do you ever get that thing where you're like, I've not got any ideas, and how am I going to do this?
Well, I mean, yeah. I look. Sometimes the ideas come, and you're like, oh, I've got to write this, and other times you're casting around for an idea to sort of bring everything together. So I think last year I did a little stopgap show for the autumn, just to sort of take me through from the end of Joy into Later Life Letter. So the show was called Pub Grub. And I think it was a sort of deliberate reaction, because Joy was an attempt to sort of describe what joy is, which is quite a sort of audacious thing to do. Like, who the fuck am I to tell you what joy is? So Pub Grub was an attempt just to go, that's about nothing. But the show ended up kind of being about something, and about the everyday, really. But I didn't know. It took me a long time to kind of get there, and a lot of sort of trying to think around it and trying to make it work. But I think that if some things come to you as a clear bit of inspiration, the show is going to be about my adoption called Later Life. That sort of came quite clean, and other things you have to sort of work at to get there. So they're more, there's more sort of intellectual graft there to try and make it all fit together. But it's they're quite fun, like those things. I don't really believe in writer's block, but I do think sometimes we're not quite ready to find our next idea yet. So some shows feel like coders on the end of the last show. So like a Pub Grub felt like a reaction to Joy more than necessarily a whole idea in itself. Whereas Later Life Letter feels like a whole idea in itself. So and who knows what the next one will be necessarily. I think the next one will not be about looking back, but about looking forward. So I'm excited, and also I think I spent about a year. I mean, I wrote some poems, but none of them felt like a new thing. And then in August this year, I wrote 2 or 3 poems that felt like I hadn't written a poem like that before. And that's when this sort of set of poem, this next poem started to come together. So I'm excited about, I'm sort of writing poems in a slightly new way for this. They're longer than they are in Later Life Letter, and they meander before they get to where they're going. And that felt new and exciting. So it just took me a while to sort of settle on that. I wouldn't say I had writer's block, but I just, I was just waiting for the next idea to hit me. And it's important not to rush it. It's important not to let that get on top of you, because that's when you start overthinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you're stressed, I mean, I'm not a writer anymore. Like, I was briefly tried to be a screenwriter, and then I realised I did the thing you were talking about at the start, where you think about what your limitations and strengths are. And I realised I was good at being a script editor, and I'd love doing this podcast as well. But I do love that. But I love that idea that I think it was Keith Richards talks about, where it's like you're like fishing for that idea out there. I don't know if I believe it, but I love the idea he talks about before, where you're like casting a net out to try and find an idea.
Yeah. Oh, fishing's
Yeah.
a good metaphor, isn't it? Because some days you don't catch anything. That's okay. You got to enjoy the process of trying to catch something.
We always sort of close the podcast, Luke, by asking our guests like what their sort of closing advice would be to anyone that wants to sort of do what they do. And I know you touched on this at the start as well, but I know that the sort of climate's changed a lot since you became a poet when you were 16 and stuff. But what would your advice be to anyone that wants to get into poetry?
Well, I think when you're starting out, you're interested in everything. None of that jadedness or cynicism set into it. No, perhaps you don't even know what you like yet, and that's really great. So I think in those precious early months and years, I would recommend reading and listening, or however you want to consume it, whether you're reading or listening or going to gigs or whatever. And probably you should be doing all of it. Reading as much and as widely as you can, because those early experiences are your artistic DNA. And I think if your tastes are Catholic, you'll probably go, actually, I don't like that, and you'll come down to what it is you like. But I think the wider that base starts off, the more interest, the more stuff you've got feeding into who you are as an artist, and to enjoy it, just to enjoy it, and to try and write like everyone, have a go at everything. Until you find your place.
No, it was really interesting, and I feel like I miss that feeling of being 16 and loving all this stuff. I think they call it portal theory or something. I think Adam Buxton, who I really like his podcast, he talks about this sometimes. It's like when you're a certain age, you take in culture and art in a different way, and I kind of do miss that feeling of watching a film, and I still get it sometimes, but it's not as common.
You think everything's amazing, and that's great. It's really nice to think that everything's amazing. So I think, embrace that. Well, you can.
Yeah, definitely. Look, Thank you very, very much for your time today.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate you sharing poems, and I've loved this conversation. It's great to meet you. And when you're in Scotland, I'll be sure to come and see your show.
I look forward to it.
Just get a real job.